But what I am suggesting is that we need to set aside whatever distaste or unease we might feel about O'Connor in order to understand more clearly why it was he who was the decisive personal force shaping Chartism and not William Lovett, even though Lovett's hand was the one that drafted the People's Charter itself. Think counterfactually for a moment. Ask yourself if history would have been different if some key factor changed. Can we conceive of Chartism without O'Connor? No. Can we conceive of Chartism without Lovett? Yes. As Dorothy Thompson observes in her book The Chartists, had the term Chartism not been coined, historians would speak quite naturally of O'Connorite radicalism to describe the popular politics of the late 1830s and 1840s, as they do naturally of Huntite radicalism after Henry Hunt, to describe the movement for parliamentary reform earlier in the 19th century. Lovett believed profoundly that the working classes had to take responsibility for their own political destiny. Acquiring his own education under difficulties, as he described it, he never ceased to be conscious of the disadvantage upon which working people lived because of the limitations of the education, if any, that they received. Lovett saw this deficiency as partly one of factual knowledge. So, for example, in 1853, he wrote a medical textbook. In it, he set out to convey what he saw as the essential content of expensive and densely written medical treatises in a form supported by profuse illustrations that could then be used as the basis for lecture notes to audiences of ordinary working people. But Lovett saw the deficiency of workers' education as also leading more critically to a lack of moral understanding and a diminished ability for active engagement in the affairs of the world. One of the great benefits of studying anatomy and human physiology, Lovett believed, was that they revealed things, as he put it, and I quote, surprisingly wonderful to arouse the curiosity of the most sluggish and apathetic mind. How to shift men and women from sluggish thinking and apathy was a consistent theme in a political career which otherwise divided into two sharply contrasting parts, as my opening cameo of the young Lovett, advocate of direct action, I hope conveyed. In Lovett's opinion, sluggish thinking and apathy made working people easily impressed by those whom he dismissed as popularity hunters such as Fergus O'Connor. I quote here from an attack made by Lovett on O'Connor as early as March 1837 at one of the mass meetings from which the relaunch of parliamentary reform as Chartism emerged. At this rally, Lovett himself made a passionate speech. To hear a set of moustached debauchees wrangling for power and plunder talk of the people, one would suppose they were talking of so many sheep, which Providence has sent to be fleeced and devoured by them, instead of human beings. O'Connor's personal life was, by all accounts, pretty colourful, and there is a world of disdain in Lovett's reference to him as a moustached debauchee. Relations between the two men soured further the following February, 1838, when O'Connor attacked Lovett for what he saw as the latter's weak opposition to proposed changes in the law governing trade unions. Lovett wanted to form a London-based pressure group to quietly lobby MPs against the changes. O'Connor, on the other hand, favoured all-out demonstrations on the street. Now, ironically, nothing came of these proposals, but they reveal fault lines in the Chartist leadership even before May 1838, when the People's Charter itself was published. O'Connor was intent upon establishing himself as a national figurehead in the campaign for radical reform. He stood squarely in a different way of seeing radical organisation from Lovett. This was not a different strategic direction, say of physical as opposed to moral force. Rather, it was the long established tradition of the gentleman leader. And it's worth our while pausing for a moment and identifying what that tradition of the gentleman radical leader embodied. 1. An essentially lower class movement finds its coordinating and focal point in a figure from within society's elites. 2. That figure is already able to vote and stand for Parliament because of the property that he owns. 3. That person is articulate and literate and able to portray himself as educated, cultured and of good social pedigree. And 4th, he also presents himself as risking personal fortune and the esteem of his peers in order to take up the cudgels to fight for working people. All of those elements characterise Fergus O'Connor's leadership of Chartism, just as they characterise Henry Hunt's leadership of radicalism in the years after Waterloo. On the other hand, Lovett and the other skilled artisans of the London Working Men's Association, and for simplicity, I'll now call that the LWMA, Lovett and the skilled artisans of the LWMA sought to create a different kind of politics. Quote, "We resolved to form an association of working men and call upon them to manage their own affairs." Lovett once wrote, and he added, "We aim to dispense with leadership of every description." So this early 1838 controversy was the occasion rather than the cause of the rift between O'Connor and Lovett. There was both a strong temperamental and a social class division between the two men. So this early 1838 controversy was the occasion rather than the cause of the rift between the two men. There was both a strong temperamental and a social class division between Lovett and O'Connor. These divisions intensified a fundamental gulf on the issue of how working class politics should be organised. Remember that the LWMA, despite the prominence given to it in histories of Chartism, was a tiny organisation. It had little more than 300 members. It was, paradoxically you might think, also very elitist. The monthly subscription of 1 shilling, 5p in modern money, put it beyond the reach of lower paid workers who received wages of around 4 shillings a day and were often not employed full time. Not only that, but LWMA membership was restricted, and I quote, to persons of good moral character. This is a very different conception of political organisation to that of O'Connor. More importantly, it is a very different conception of political organisation to the mass mobilisation of northern workers around the causes of factory reform and opposition to the New Poor Law, causes on which Chartism was able to draw as it emerged in the summer of 1838. That mobilisation created a vast, vigorous mass political movement. No subscription necessary, just a willingness to march and protest. Faced with political injustice, O'Connor's every instinct is to take to the streets and make passionate denunciations. Lovett's instinct is to form a committee and print pamphlets. Now, I put it to you that O'Connor's instincts were the right ones for the context and political situation in which he was operating. A context wherein the payment of regular subscriptions was financially impossible for a majority of workers, where many were unable to read, and where there was already widespread social discontent and distress. The LWMA was a self-appointed artisan elite, closely organised with the intellectual and practical resources to proceed in a self-confident manner. It was not a mass movement of the people, most of whom were indifferently educated, underemployed or unemployed, and therefore with very little disposable income. O'Connor's loud arrival into London radical politics comes about because he perceived that the LWMA on its own would never mobilise metropolitan opinion on a scale that could ever achieve universal suffrage, the main aim of Chartism. And it's that entry, very much a forced entry from Lovett's perspective, that adds injury to the insult of O'Connor's claim that Lovett and the LWMA were actually aiding and abetting the suppression of trade unions. That sense of insult and injury is vividly present in Lovett's response to this attempt by O'Connor to direct the defence of trade unionism. Quote, "You must be the leader of the people. You are the great I am of politics, the great personification of radicalism. Fergus O'Connor." The Chartist movement then is cleft in two, even before the concept of Chartism had actually emerged. But does this actually matter? Is it a divide that was fatal to the movement's chances of success? I put it to you that it wasn't, and these are my reasons. Firstly, the style of the LWMA, as I hope I've conveyed, is not a style calculated to create mass agitation. O'Connor calculated that the only means of holding the passionate and volatile forces of provincial radicalism together were by strength of passionate oratory and personality, mutually reinforced by a lively popular newspaper press. The latter, of course, meant primarily the Northern Star, which O'Connor owned and for which he wrote at length every week. But it's important to note that, egotistical though he undoubtedly was, the personality and oratory were not O'Connor's alone. He greatly admired and publicised the efforts of others whom he saw as supplying those same qualities. Joseph Rayner Stevens, Richard Osler, and Peter McDowell, for example. And he publicly supported other Chartist newspapers, notably the English Chartist Circular, owned and edited by a London radical who had worked closely with Lovett, and probably the English Chartist Circular also, we should note, the paper which did more than any to promote temperance Chartism. So secondly, O'Connor's style was not one that was intrinsically opposed to other leaders contributing to the movement. Much though he made Chartism his own, this was not to the exclusion of others taking a leading part in it. But even had O'Connor been so self-effacing and generous of spirit to apologise to Lovett in early 1838, it probably would have made no difference to the political trajectory that Chartism took. Why? Because in terms of the defining characteristics of Chartism, the characteristics that made it so a potent and disturbing a force within British domestic politics in the 1830s and 1840s, those characteristics flowed from the movement that O'Connor represented and sought to hold together. Thirdly, the O'Connor-Lovett division is of limited significance because it's decidedly not one about moral as opposed to physical force. This is a point that derives directly from an issue I mentioned earlier, the way in which Lovett sanitised his autobiography and historians' subsequent heavy, perhaps even lazy, reliance upon it. The young Lovett I sketched when I began this lecture was a long time growing up. In 1839, he was hardly any quicker to condemn violence than O'Connor was, and although Lovett would more frequently express perhaps a preference for prudence, he certainly had not rejected the idea that the Chartists would achieve their objectives peaceably if we may, but forcibly if we must. The idea that Lovett was pitched into a battle with, as he put it in his autobiography, quote, a few mad advisers who by furious appeals to the passions of the multitude stirred up the demons of hate, prejudice and discord to obstruct Chartism's onward progress, that idea is nonsense. But that idea is the one that Lovett put forward in his Life and Struggles in 1876. And in case his readers were in any doubt as to whom he was referring, in the next paragraph he helpfully referred specifically to, quote, the violent ravings about physical force by O'Connor, Stevens and Osler. One of the most enduring themes in Chartist historiography is therefore to a considerable extent the consequence of a 76-year-old mid-Victorian suppressing the passion with which he had advocated his political opinions 40 years before. Early historians of Chartism, tasked with the need of trying to explain why Chartism failed, read back from the views of the older Lovett and constructed an inherent and fatal flaw within early Chartism where it did not exist. Chartism did not fail because O'Connor rather than Lovett became its most eminent leader. All Chartists in 1839 faced a profound strategic dilemma. If petitioning the political establishment to dissolve itself does not work, what do you do then?